Hi everybody, welcome to my video and welcome to my channel. If you are one of my students, I'm really pleased to see you, and if you have accidentally stumbled across my channel, you are very welcome and I hope this is useful. We are working from home at the moment because obviously schools are closed because of the coronavirus. So the idea of this channel is just to make sure that everybody can touch base and that we can carry on our IB English learning even though we are working from home and only seeing each other virtually. So today is basically another talk through of Streetcar Named Desire. We're looking at scene 4. And so yesterday's video we left Mitch and Blanche sitting on the stairs. We've had this horrible, horrific scene where Stanley and his heaven-splitting violence erupts and he abuses his pregnant wife, Stella. And so the idea of this next scene is how does Williams actually bring us back into the framework of the play after this horrible, horrible tension? And as he often does, he begins the scene in a very different way to the ending of the scene before, because as I said yesterday in the last video, this idea of the play taking place in one very, very small space means that he has to be very, very clever in the way that he manipulates tension between the scenes. So basically we begin scene 4 and Stella is on her own on the bed looking very serene and contented, and so we've had the end of the previous scene with Mitch and Blanche on the stairs and Blanche saying how much she needs kindness right now, pulling the events of the night before again to revolve around her. And we have Stella alone on the bed looking serene and contented. Blanche appears looking nervous and hysterical, so she rushes up to Stella. She's had a sleepless night upstairs. She's very tender towards him, but Stella draws away. She's quite stiff and cold with Blanche. And it's obvious that she and Stanley have reconciled, and it's probably not the first time that this has happened. And so she has actually normalized this. Now, we've got to be really careful because as a modern audience, we might judge this a little bit, and obviously Blanche does judge it, but we need to be very, very, I suppose, conscious of the fact that when this was produced in 1946, perhaps the things that we know now about the cycles of abusive relationships were not so clear then. So, you know, it's very important to remember the context in which these things were framed, and Stella shouldn't be judged too harshly, I think, given the context that she was in, okay? So with what we know now about these kinds of things, it's easy to be quite judgmental, but this is now, what are we, like 80 years later? So, is it 80? We're in 2020, okay, so more or less. So basically, then we have then we have Blanche criticizing Stanley and his behavior and really attacking Stella to a certain degree. She concocts this plan in her mind about how she's going to get them all out of this by phoning up an old suitor who she ran into in Miami and is married, and so we can see the way that her mind is sort of obsessive compulsively projecting how people are supposed to behave and how people are supposed to rescue her, and we can see really clearly how far that is from the actual reality of her situation. But her thinking out loud and her obsessive projections help us to see that in this scene as well. So while it's not a critical scene in the sense that there's less dramatic tension and less kind of key events, the dynamics are quite clearly painted by Williams here. It's really important as well that by the end of the scene, it's very clear that Stella is going to go back to Stanley. He hugs Stella and they embrace, and while they're doing that, Stanley, who's heard Blanche speaking badly about him, he looks at her and smiles, and so we know that he is going to win. That's the feeling that we have from this point, and we're just not sure how it's going to happen or how that victory is going to take place as an audience. But we do know that somehow that balance has shifted, that if there is a decision to be made between Blanche and Stanley, that Stella is always going to pick Stanley. Okay, so we're just going to do a talk through here, the same way that we did yesterday. So we start with scene 4. It's early the following morning. There's confusion in the streets. Cries like a choral chant. Stella's lying in the bedroom. Her face is serene. She's sort of the stereotypical picture of contented maternity. And this is quite interesting considering what happened the night before was quite hellish, wasn't it? It's sort of the underbelly of humanity in this drunken, seedy, vulgar, violent poker night. And then now we've got this almost kind of almost religious image of, you know, the woman putting her hand on her belly, sort of iconic imagery. And so she's got that tranquility. The table is sloppy. The outside door is slightly ajar on a sky of summer brilliance. Blanche hasn't slept, and so her body language as well is very jittery. She's twitchy, and that's in direct contrast to Stella's calmness. And when you consider the fact that Stella was actually beaten the night before, it seems very strange to go from scene 3, where she's been beaten, into scene 4, where she's all tranquil and calm, and the person who's agitated and obsessive is Blanche. And then we have Stella's kind of languid movements. She grins lazily, she stirs lazily, but Blanche is the one who throws herself down next to Stella in hysterical tenderness. Everything about her body language is going to be hysterical here. And the first thing she says is baby, but my baby sister. And again, we can see this sort of default mode where she's infantilizing Stella, whereas in actual fact Stella's in a very serious situation, and she's obviously doing what she needs to survive as well. Stella pulls away from her. She's tired of her. She's very weary. And it's interesting because in that first scene, Williams actually says that Stella responds to Blanche wearily. And so the idea of this, I think, is that Stella's very tired of Blanche. This has been going on for years and years, this idea of having to humour Blanche, having to give her what she needs. And where in this dynamic is Stella actually emotionally receiving what she needs from Blanche? But she's tired of it, you know, and now that Blanche is effectively going to ask her to choose between her husband and her sister, she's going to lose her patience, I think. Blanche, will he be back? Blanche has always been a little bit scared of Stanley anyway. That first instance when Stella in scene 1 tells her that she hasn't told Stanley that she's coming to visit, that Blanche is coming to visit, Blanche is frightened. And that is the general dynamic, isn't it? And Blanche is quite funny actually here, because this whole scene is quite ironic. She talks about madness and she talks about Stanley being mad. And in actual fact, that sort of foreshadows quite ironically what happens a bit later on in the sense that she retreats into her own sort of compulsions. And she says, why, I've been half crazy, Stella, when I found out you'd been insane enough to come back here. So the lexical set of sanity, insanity, Blanche is the one generating that. And again, that's really ironic, isn't it? And then she becomes quite imperious and demanding with Stella. She says, what were you thinking of? Answer me, what? That's quite similar to Stanley, isn't it? This idea of demanding, trying to control, trying to insist, trying to force other people to do what you want them to do. And so Blanche is quite similar to that as well. And so it does make me feel quite a lot of empathy for Stella, this idea that she's got Blanche making her demands on one side, and then she's got Stanley on the other side making his demands as well. And I suppose there's sort of the verbal and psychological aggression of Blanche towards Stella, but also the physical aggression from Stanley. And so she's sort of trapped in the middle, isn't she? And she's right to be quite tired, I think. And then Stella's just not going to humour her. Her first response is, oh, Blanche, I'd forgotten how excitable you are. You're making much too much fuss about this. Stella's not playing along. She's not going to humour Blanche here in the same way that she did before, because she's really being asked to criticise her own husband. And she also retreats a little bit into denial, doesn't she? And so we have Blanche and her denial, but also we have Stella and her denial as well, although that could be quite a modern reading of this. But she normalises and minimises what Stanley's done. And that's quite, I suppose, sort of typical of that sort of relationship. So he was as good as a lamb when I came back. He's really very, very ashamed of himself. And so it's clear that she's been quite manipulated as well by Stanley. And she is also retreating into her own sort of illusions, her own projections about him. And what's really ironic here is that Blanche does actually see him in the same way that Stanley could see through Blanche and her fine clothes and her airs and her courtesies and her language. Blanche at this point in time can also see through Stanley, and she sees him as he is. She can see this very, very clearly. Yet it's Stella who's actually normalizing or denying or putting, I suppose, a Chinese lantern over the naked truth of Stanley here as well. And so when we talk about illusion and denial within the context of the play, we're talking about lots of different people using this in order to protect their perceptions or their own sort of understanding of the reality. And she diminishes it. She continues, oh, Stanley's always smashed things. Why, on our wedding night, he snatched off one of my slippers and rushed about the place, smashing the light bulbs with it. And Blanche is obviously horrified, but Stella's kind of normalised this and finds it quite funny. And she says, I was sort of thrilled by it. And so there's this confusion of passion and violence, isn't there? This sort of mistaking of something that's violent for something that's passionate. And it does make you wonder a little bit about where Stella's come from. So in terms of her own background, what she's looking for, what she's attracted to. Because obviously Blanche is still quite attracted to that as well, or at least she was at the beginning of the play, the sort of alpha violence and the blurring of the lines between violence and passion. Or mistaking one for the other. And so, Blanche is quite a hypocrite. She goes on and she's horrified by this. She can't believe that Stella's maintaining this illusion that Stanley's just a little extreme, when in actual fact, everything that he's done really, and the things that Stella is telling her sister are emblematic of violence. And she's very flat, Stella, here, in the sense that every time that Blanche says something, in order to kind of provoke a response, Stella responds with something flat and neutral. So she sort of says, Blanche says, do you suppose I wanted any breakfast? Because obviously she's so upset and distraught by the events of the evening before. And Stella brings it back down again. There's some coffee left on the stove. And Blanche actually says, you're so matter-of-fact about it. And that's the reality, isn't it? That Stella's, I suppose, job in these two relationships that she has, these quite toxic relationships, are to calm Stanley down and forgive him, and also to calm Blanche down and keep her stable. And so there's these two different things. And Blanche is quite critical of the fact that she does this for Stanley, because she's quite deluded. She doesn't see also that Stella is doing this for her as well. And she says, you're standing there smiling. And Blanche gets really upset, says, pull yourself together and face the facts, which is really ironic coming from Blanche, isn't it? Because her whole identity is constructed around not facing facts and actually misrepresenting and distorting things. But it's really interesting that Blanche can say these things when it's about a situation that doesn't actually involve her own identity, when her own identity isn't being threatened. She can see quite clearly, can't she? So pull yourself together and face the facts. And again, Stella pulls it back in again, responds quite flatly, kind of quite sardonically, kind of, oh, and what are those facts, in your opinion? She's pulling it back in. And Blanche tries to escalate again. In my opinion, you're married to a madman. And then Stella pulls it back down again. Just, no. And then she responds again, yes. I'm not in anything I want to get out of. And we come back round again to that line a bit later on. And I think Williams is doing this to show us the kind of the cyclical nature of Blanche's sort of obsessive, compulsive, circling mindset. Because she begins to say, you're not old, you can get out. And Stella has to continue repeating, I'm not in anything I have a desire to get out of. And then Blanche goes back, I don't understand you. I don't understand your indifference. Is this a Chinese philosophy you've cultivated? And she's been quite critical here, and again quite hypocritical, this idea that somehow Stella is artificially, she's found some sort of philosophical way of justifying her own denial, which is really interesting because actually really that's what Blanche does as well. And then Stella's really confused. And she says, oh, this shuffling about and mumbling as if nothing out of the ordinary has happened. That's really what Blanche does. So it's so interesting that her attacks on Stella and her criticisms of Stella are actually a projection of what she herself is doing. And I suppose that's part of Blanche's pathology, isn't it? And she goes on, and she's aware that she's spinning and circling, because a bit later on she says, let me think, if only my mind would function. We've got to get hold of some money, that's the way out. And so she's spinning again, she's circling around this kind of obsessive idea. She's caught onto this seed of an idea, won't let it go, and is continuing and expanding it and extending it to a point that becomes quite ridiculous. And again, Stella responds, again, sardonically, ironically, tired. She says, yeah, I guess that money is always nice to get hold of, but she's not buying into this scheme, even though Blanche is sort of getting carried away with it herself. And she says, of course you remember Shep Huntley. Do you remember Shep Huntley? Of course you remember Shep Huntley. She's almost answering for Stella again. And again, this shows that she's thinking out loud and her brain is kind of spinning out of control. I went out with him in college and wore his pin. I went to Miami thinking, I took the trip as an investment thinking I'd meet someone with $1 million. You can see how she takes these little seeds of ideas and just explodes and projects her own need onto this. And it becomes ridiculous. This idea that she goes on a vacation assuming that she's going to meet a millionaire. And of course that millionaire is going to fall in love with her. And of course that millionaire is going to save her if she ever gets into trouble. And so this idea of just projecting her need onto people and extending and spinning out of control with expectations. I don't know what that noise is, sorry. Spinning out of control with expectations is where her compulsiveness and her obsessiveness lies. And again, Stella's responding ironically, but Blanche can't pick up on it. She says, oh, he had a convertible that must have been a block long. And Stella says, I should think it would have been inconvenient in traffic. And so there's a lot of irony here in Stella's responses. She's putting up with it, she's not engaging in it, and she's really kind of expressing, she's been quite, I suppose, disrespectful to Blanche in a way, mirroring Blanche's disrespect to her. And then again, Blanche is still out of control. She's so disconnected from other people's understanding of situations that she doesn't see Stella's sarcasm. And she gets carried away with this again. Texas is literally spouting gold in his pockets. So this hyperbole, this projection keeps kicking in. And then, of course, he's going to set them up in a shop. And so we can see how she moves from one step to the next, 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 without any real justification for her original idea, which was basically that she went on vacation to Miami. And it jumps from bit to bit to bit. And then we find out that he's actually married. And so we can see how ridiculous her whole train of thought. But also we have this really interesting moment where she doesn't know how to make a phone call. And so we can see that she's got all of this very sophisticated sort of justification of her own ideas. And then it brings her back. She decides that she's going to send this message and doesn't know how to use the telephone. She says, I can't dial, I'm too. When in actual fact, she doesn't really know how to do it. And Stella has to actually tell her, just dial O. O? Yes, O for operator. And then she puts the phone down. Rather than admitting that she doesn't really know how to do it, she'll just go off on another tangent. And so it's quite exhausting to listen to Blanche, kind of talking through her brain, what's happening in her brain. It's tiring. And so, but we can see from that moment that she's got this very sort of extensive fantasy world, yet her interaction with the real world is so impractical and so inadequate in terms of actually, I suppose, not even just surviving, but actually coping, in the sense that she doesn't know how to use a telephone to actually contact this man, which is faintly ridiculous, isn't it? And we can see Stella in our mind's eye just sort of rolling her eyes and going, oh God, please be quiet. But she keeps going, and then she decides she's going to do it with a pencil on a slip of paper. And then she says something like, oh, you never get anywhere with direct appeals. And so she's jumping from idea to idea to idea. And then Stella finally laughs at her and says, oh, don't be so ridiculous, darling. And what we can see in Stella here is a sort of woman who's made up her mind. You know, she's sort of chosen her life quite consciously. You know, she needed to get out of Belrev, she needed to make money, so she went out and she did that. And so she's got this situation that I suppose in her mind is unpleasant, but she loves Stanley, she's made her bed, she's made her choices, and she's going to live with them. And whether we agree with that or not, that is her right, isn't it? Whereas Blanche, getting kind of carried away with her sort of hysterical compulsions, there's something very impulsive, reactive about that. That's tiring for Stella, who's making her choices quite consciously. And whereas Blanche is sort of being driven by her own compulsions. And, Blanche says then, Stella says that she'll give her some money, and Blanche's response is, no, I'll take to the streets. It's very dramatic, isn't it? Very diva-like. And again, that doesn't fit in with Stella's very sort of solid, conscious decision-making, which we may or may not agree with, but she's making her own mind up. Whereas Blanche is just responding kind of quite compulsively, I'll take to the streets, which is, again, ironic considering what we find out a bit later about her. And then we go back to this obsessive compulsiveness, and she says, I've got to get hold of a bromo. I'll fix you one now, says Stella. And Blanche says, not yet. I've got to keep thinking. Actually, to a certain degree, thinking is the last thing that Blanche needs to do, because it's not really considered or conscious or based on evidence. It's just this automatic circling around and around. And Stella says, oh, I wish you'd just let things go, at least for a while. And that tells us that she's tired. It really does. And then again, Blanche goes back. Stella, I can't live with him. How could I stay here with him? She pulls it back to be about her, rather than actually thinking about Stella and respecting her choices. And then we go back in. What a man has to offer is animal force. And then she goes back around again. I have to plan for us both, to get us both out. This is exactly what she said earlier. And so she's gone kind of round in a circle, hasn't she? Which is tiring for everybody. And then Stella says, again, you take it for granted that I'm in something that I want to get out of. And so the conversation that she's having with Blanche, it's almost like there's two conversations happening at the same time. Blanche is incapable of listening to Stella because she's so much in her own head and jumping from idea to idea. And so that scene hasn't really moved forward. It hasn't moved us forward in the sense that Stella's using the same language that she's had to use right at the beginning of the scene. Blanche is using the same language, and neither is getting through to the other. Okay, and then because that's not working, Blanche goes on the attack, and she attacks Stanley, doesn't she? And we can see here, in terms of Blanche, what part of what really offends her about Stanley. She says, I understand how it happened a little. You saw him in a uniform, an officer. So she's saying, I can understand how physically you might respond to him, or you might be carried away by the romantic idea of him as an officer, you know, in the war and everything. But how did it really happen? How did you really fall in love with him? And she goes on to say, what you're talking about is brutal desire, just desire. And that's really interesting because she tries to diminish it. She tries to denigrate this idea of desire. Whereas in actual fact, that's a lot of what drives Blanche, isn't it? The desire to be loved, the desire to be appreciated, the desire to be safe. And so there's a lot of her own desire kind of compelling her own actions and her own kind of thinking process. And I suppose that's part of the metaphor of the streetcar, isn't it? Desire. It starts on its journey and you can't stop it. It goes on its rail and it's difficult to halt it. And so she's diminishing something that actually is quite a driver for her and that she herself is unable to stop. And so, again, there's some irony in there, isn't there, in the way that this is characterized when she says, what you're talking about is brutal desire, just desire. The name of that rattletrap streetcar that bangs through the quarter, up one old narrow street and down another. And she says, Stella responds and says, haven't you ever ridden on that streetcar? And obviously there's a euphemism there, isn't there, about sexual desire and sexual attraction, again, which is ironic because really Blanche was originally sexually attracted to Stanley, and there is that compulsion between the two of them. But also on a wider level, the desire to move forwards. Stella has the desire to have a family. Stanley has the desire to be desired, to be in control, to have power, to be socially mobile, to be financially successful. All of the characters in here are driven by desire. And so that question, I think, is wider than just for Blanche about sex. But Blanche's response is interesting because she can't really see it. She says, it brought me here. But what does that mean? What desire brought her to live with Stella? What was it really? Was it the desire to be safe? Was it the desire to not be haunted by her memories? Was it the desire to be in a family? We're not quite sure what desire that was that brought her here on a wider scale. But it could also be read quite literally. Haven't you ever ridden on that streetcar? Yes, it brought me here. Maybe she is actually just thinking of the streetcar itself. And so we can understand that in different ways as an audience. But it may be that Blanche is just too blind to see the other desires that have brought her there as well, and the other desires that are driving people inside the body of the play. And then Stella, she's still tired. Don't you think your superior attitude is a bit out of place? And there's an irony in there, isn't there? Because it's a bit of a rhetorical question. We know that her superior attitude is very much out of place. And, then she retreats back into this sort of very diva-ish drama. She says, I tremble for you. I tremble for you. And that's very dramatic. It's almost like a film actress, isn't it? The kind of thing that they would have said, in those sorts of movies, the very dramatic sort of, consumptive kind of delicate actress, just too sensitive to be able to deal with reality. And so she retreats back into a kind of script. Stella doesn't play along with it. And this is a scene where Stella doesn't respond to the script that Blanche wants her to respond to, and her response is actually quite similar to something that Stanley said earlier on. Blanche says, then I tremble for you, I just tremble for you. And Stella's response is quite harsh. Well, I can't help your trembling if you insist on trembling. And that reminds me very much of that part in scene 3 where Blanche comes into the poker night and she says, don't get up. And Stanley says, don't worry, we weren't going to. This is very similar in tone and sort of characterization, isn't it? I can't help your trembling if you insist on trembling. It's quite brusque, isn't it? And then Blanche says, may I speak plainly? And the implication is that she hasn't been speaking plainly up until now, but she has been speaking quite plainly. She's been quite rude generally about people. And Stanley comes in and he sees them and hears their conversation. And this is where Blanche goes on the attack in terms of class. This is the struggle of the old South against new money, new people, vulgarity of modernity, resentfulness towards post-Second World War society where people who, I suppose, don't know their place, according to that paradigm, people who don't know their place are suddenly getting opportunities and able to be successful. And so we have this obsolete, defunct, pseudo-aristocracy attacking, I suppose, the new go-getting social order, driving forwards with progress, mechanization, social mobility to a certain degree. And it's a social order that doesn't have any time for this sort of past that limited people's opportunities. And so she attacks him on that level as almost a representative of this class struggle. He's common, he's bestial, he acts like an animal, he has an animal's habits, he eats like one, moves like one, talks like one. There's something subhuman, yes, ape-like about him. She's almost enjoying this. She's enjoying this attack because it's also representative, I think, not just of Stanley, but about this wider resentment about people being more successful and having more opportunities and not recognizing limitations that the old order imposed upon them. And so this is a much wider attack coming from Blanche. Stanley Kowalski, survivor of the Stone Age. He's an immigrant, he's primitive, he's out of his league, he's out of his place. That's her attack, when the reality is that the person who's out of her league to a certain degree and out of her place and time is Blanche. But it's that resentment, you waiting for him. Such things as art, as poetry, as music, blah, 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 blah. Since the Stone Age, these things have come into light since the Stone Age. He's too primitive to understand them. And we have to make these grow and cling to them and hold them as our flag. And that's really Blanche, isn't it? Clinging to things. For dear life, her existence is threatened if she lets any part of her illusion drop or any part of her social superiority drop. And this idea, she says, don't hang back with the brutes. This is really important, I think, within the play itself and in terms of what Williams is actually doing in terms of social commentary, because I think what we're saying is we've got this, there must be a middle way. We have Blanche and her defunct, obsolete, social order that has no meaning in this new world. And then on the other extreme, we have this brutish violence. And I think in both cases, it's a dangerous world. If either of these sides is in control, then that doesn't bode well for the rest of us. And so I think maybe what we're looking at is some kind of middle way, something in the middle. But Williams doesn't offer us that within the body of the play itself. We have Stanley on one side, who's a brute and violent, and we have Blanche on the other, who's I suppose violence in terms of the violence represented by that social order is quite extreme as well. And so, Williams doesn't offer us anything particularly as a solution, I think, but it's rather highlighting the inadequacy or the danger of either end. And then Stanley comes in, and he's obviously heard what's going on. We've got this deception as well. I mean, all this idea of Stanley being plain speaking and very direct and laying his cards on the table, he's actually quite deceptive as well because he pretends he hasn't heard them. And so we've got all of the characters here involved in deception on some level or another. It's not as if Stanley tells the truth and Blanche lies. He's also deceptive and he's capable of quite extreme manipulation. He's manipulated Stella in this scene in the sense that he behaved like a lamb. So he beats her up and then behaves like a lamb. There's a deception in there as well, manipulation. He comes in with the packages and pretends that he hasn't heard them. Again, deception. And so he says, "Hi, Stella, is Blanche back?" "Yeah, she's back." And then he grins at her. Grins at Blanche. Doesn't say anything about what he's heard. And then Stella embraces him with both arms, fiercely and full in the view of Blanche. And so she's showing Blanche by that body language and by embracing him that if she has to make a choice, the choice will be Stanley. And that foreshadows what happens a bit later on, doesn't it? And then over Stella's head, he's got her head underneath his, and he sort of just grins at her like, "I win." So the fact that he's managed to possess Stella means that he is going to beat Blanche at this game, in this power struggle. And so even though it's quite a delicate scene in the sense that we don't have anybody beating anybody up, we don't have any new revelations or new information, the way that the characters talk to each other and the way that that scene unfolds in terms of giving us a sense of Blanche's mind and the circularity of it and the obsessiveness of it, and also the class struggle and the resentment of the old guard against the new comes through really, really clearly in her attacks on Stanley as well. And also Williams, I suppose, in terms of the structure of the play, is just letting us know really, really clearly that this will not end well. There will be somebody who wins and there will be somebody who loses. And we're pretty sure that it's going to be Stanley who wins. But, you know, at this point in time, we don't know how. We don't know exactly how that's going to play out or what the consequences are going to be. So it's obviously, it's a low-key scene in a lot of ways. But at the same time, it's really, really important in terms of character development, in terms of also the motif. And we've got music at the end as well. So that scene closes, we have Stanley smiling and we have this music playing. That's quite chilling as well. And, you know, as an audience, we know that this is not going to end well. Okay, so that is scene 4. I hope that was useful in terms of showing how it operates in terms of the body of the play, but also in terms of how characters are developed and how their relationships work, and how perhaps we might see a little bit more in terms of the context and in terms of Williams' idea of social commentary inside the play itself. Okay, so thank you very much, and I'll see you next time. Bye.